So, without further ado, I will introduce our speaker for this morning, and I'm delighted to have with us Dr. Marga Gual Soler. She's a senior science diplomacy advisor to the Geneva Science and Diplomacy Anticipator, and she is the founder of SciDipGLOBAL, which is a purpose-driven advisory, strategy, research, and training firm that helps government, universities, international organizations, and scientific institutions to strengthen the role of science in global policy for multilateralism. She is passionate about developing the next generation of science and diplomacy leaders to tackle global challenges. She participated in the largest ever Women in STEM expedition to Antarctica to elevate women's leadership in sustainability and climate action. And she was recognized as a young global leader by the World Economic Forum. She also happens to be a member of the SKO's diplomatic task force. So we are absolutely thrilled to have Dr. Soler with us. Thank you very much for joining us. And I will spotlight you for everyone's benefit so we can see you. There you go. There you are. Morning, Marga.
Good morning, Matthew, and everyone in Zoom and in the room. Can you hear me and see me okay?
We can hear you fine.
Okay, and the video is also good?
The video is very clear, so you may start.
Okay, thank you so much. Let me just share my screen. As you can see, my background is not in the current environment of heat in Europe. So I try to counter that. I am in Mallorca in Spain. And as all of you, many of you are experiencing one of the worst heat waves, or the worst in the UK, right, on record. So try to put some refreshing background to counter that from my trip to Antarctica, as you mentioned in your introduction. So let me start by thanking SKO and Pari for the invitation. It is really exciting to be with you today, and sorry I missed the previous sessions. Perhaps what I will say will be already redundant with some of the rich sessions and discussions that you already had, so I apologize in advance if it's repeating, but I think some of the elements that I want to address today and touch upon are perhaps less discussed in terms of the public awareness of science and research, because I'm going to focus a little more on the diplomatic and science for peace aspect of research infrastructures, which in the end is about societal impact, right? So hopefully this is interesting to you and relevant to all of you. And I will be very brief. I know that you'll be very strict with time. So I would like to have some time for questions, if that's okay, and discussion. So just as a word of introduction, I wear different hats. The latest one, I'm very pleased to have joined the Science and Diplomatic Task Force of the SKO, which is a very, very exciting initiative to enlarge the membership of SKO and make sure for global we can have global participation as far and wide as possible. I am also working with GESDA, the Geneva Science and Diplomacy Anticipator, which is a new Swiss foundation set up to anticipate the diplomatic frameworks and the governance frameworks that are going to be required for emerging technologies in the next decades. And as a word of my career and my background, as you see, I put my career on a map because I think this is the best way to illustrate. I am a molecular biologist by training, but 10 years ago, I transitioned into the world of diplomacy, first the UN in New York, and then in a number of scientific societies like AAAS, universities, also UNESCO and other UN agencies, the EU, and so forth. So I have had a flavor of how science intersects with diplomacy, with global policy, with global governance through different stakeholders, actors, perspectives, and countries. So hopefully I can provide some of those insights today and focus them on the topic of the conference. So let me just start with just a very brief overview of what we call science diplomacy. Some of you might be very familiar with this concept. Some of you might be hearing it for the first time. So I just want to give a little bit of background. And science diplomacy is a relatively new term that describes a very old practice. So let me explain that. It's a new term because it was coined as a concept a little over 10 years ago by the Royal Society in London and the AAAS in Washington, DC, through this report that you see here, this New Frontiers in Science Diplomacy, which established the first definition and framework of for how science and diplomacy can come together. And the idea is for science to provide this common language for international cooperation, different countries to come together to manage joint resources, build joint infrastructures. And in this scientific cooperation, we can see and we can already identify that we can have a spillover effects or collateral effects that might benefit the political environment, society at large. So it's not just about the international cooperation in science for the pursuit of knowledge and to advance knowledge and advance our understanding of the world, which is, of course, very important, but how this international cooperation can yield broader benefits in the relations between countries. And I say it's an old practice because, of course, this is not new. Science has been used as a language of diplomacy, as a tool for international understanding, for peace, for many centuries. And so just an example, since we are, or you are in the UK, this anecdote of the Royal Society in the 18th century, when Newton was president of the Royal Society, the first foreign secretary of the Royal Society was appointed before the British government appointed a Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs, so a foreign minister, right? So the idea of scientists being ambassadors and being global and interacting with peers around the world and collaborating with peers around the world and gathering knowledge. That is something that has happened for a very long time. But in recent decades and years, we have seen a need to structure this concept, to give it a framework so we can research it, we can teach it, we can put it in practice. And it has almost become a new discipline. Of course, it's very interdisciplinary because science and diplomacy come from different worlds, academic and in practice and in scholarship, but we are seeing in the last 10 years an explosion of this concept, both in the practical aspects and also in research and the intellectual foundation for it. So in the past century, we find some examples of science serving as this bridge for diplomacy, and it is very common to see when countries come back from periods of conflict or political strain or difficulties in their relationships. The first agreements that usually were signed were scientific agreements. So you see example of the US and Japan after World War II, the example of space cooperation between the US and the Soviet Union during the Cold War. And that's, of course, already going into the topic of international infrastructures. Of course, CERN is one of the oldest ones that we can describe as a science and diplomacy initiative from the start, because it was built to bring together scientists from a divided Europe after the war to rebuild scientific cooperation and also to help rebuild European institutions along the way. And the latest example that we can see also in this picture is Sesame, which is a synchrotron in Jordan that brings together about 10 countries in the Middle East, countries that, as you know, and as you can imagine, not always have the best political or diplomatic understanding, but they do agree to work together in this infrastructure, in this scientific facility for the benefit of all. So science diplomacy is not new, but now we are giving it this name, this framework, this conceptualization, and it allows us now to move forward with more deliberate, intentionally, and be more deliberate on how we approach this intersection between science and diplomacy. So in in 2011, this framework was proposed by AAAS and the Royal Society, basically describing 3 pillars for science diplomacy, how science diplomacy into play. And I'm just going to go over them very briefly, and you'll see then how we can connect each of them with the research infrastructures, which are central actors and pillars of science diplomacy. And by the way, I put a link in this slide. I can share the slides after if you want to have a full overview and a longer talk about this. I have an online course that I developed a few years ago with AAAS that you can watch for free at your own pace. And this is a more comprehensive overview than we have time today. So the first framework for science diplomacy described 3 pillars. How we can use diplomacy to advance science, how can science inform diplomacy, and also how can science advance diplomacy in these situations of tensions or political differences between countries. And so basically, as I was saying earlier, science diplomacy is not equivalent to international science cooperation because it's about this science cooperation having broader goals and achieving broader goals. So improved relations, trust between governments, societies, productive cooperation, joint efforts developing national scientific ecosystems, but really about the broader impacts of science and not just the collaboration, as I was saying, for the pursuit of knowledge and scientific publications and advancing understanding. And so the way I like to frame the 3 pillars, it's about, as I said, diplomatic relations advancing science, science informing diplomatic relations, and science improving diplomatic relations. And I'd like to just touch on a few examples of how research infrastructures play a role. Perhaps the most obvious example that we can see already in many of the research infrastructures from around the world is the diplomacy for science dimension. So how diplomatic actors facilitate science cooperation, sharing resources, infrastructures between governments for types of projects that would be too expensive and also it wouldn't make sense for each country to have their own, right? So it wouldn't make sense for every country to have their own SKA. It would make much more sense to have a joint effort, same with CERN, same with space station. But now, of course, we will talk about this in the end. We are seeing a kind of a trend towards nationalism in terms of bringing those infrastructures home and not so much sharing with the world. And this is a discussion that I want to have with you because this is really a trending topic and shifting paradigm. And so at the macro level, governments, through their diplomatic representatives, negotiate these locations and funding and membership and governance of research infrastructures. That's the macro level of diplomacy for science, but also in the micro level, the day-to-day work, getting visas, research permits. So if you're a scientist, you need to travel to another country to do field work, to collaborate with another colleague, to attend a conference. Those are, for many people around the world, not trivial steps, because someone in a consulate needs to stamp your passport and say, yes, this person can come into my country to perform this research or to collaborate with this institution. And so perhaps as scientists, and I speak for myself as a scientist, former scientist, we tend to kind of write off these aspects as bureaucracy, and we have, of course, legal departments, and we have admin support that helps us deal with this. But it's very important as a scientist, we understand that diplomacy plays a key role in both the micro and the macro and micro level to enable this international cooperation in science. And it's important that we understand it. And so here I will put a lot of examples that probably you have already discussed, but obviously I think it's worth reinforcing, for example, the SKA and how it has now become an international organization. So this is the key message that I want to bring you today, that international research infrastructures are both scientific and diplomatic entities. And the diplomatic aspect is the one that is less known. and perhaps less discussed or even neglected, right? We focus on the science, which is very important, but without the diplomatic underpinnings, the governance, the legal agreements, we would not be able to set up and manage and govern this infrastructure. So the questions of who are the members, who can be a member, what types of members do we have, who pays for it, where are we putting this infrastructure, where are we building it, what are the conditions from the host country to allow or to host this infrastructure in their territory, how much time or observation or experiment time each country gets through each tier of membership. So all of these questions are scientific, but also diplomatic, and they are negotiated. And once a country becomes a member of the organization, needs to abide by those rules, right? And signing an accession to an international organization like SKO, like CERN, like the space station. It comes with some rules, and it's a binding agreement that then the national parliament has to approve, and it becomes a very formal commitment that the country decides to join and undertake. And so here, in my last visit to Jordan, where you are now, I had the pleasure of visiting both the scientific and the diplomatic parts of it, and think this picture really illustrates both in the background and in the flags and the members. And I think we have to, in terms of public awareness, we have to emphasize, and we have to, in our communication, make more emphasis and reinforce the idea that those are not just scientific places run by scientists that do very complicated work. It is also about membership that is a diplomatic commitment that the countries are investing in and getting a lot of benefits in return. So I think that part needs to be, I think, emphasized. And probably you've talked about it, or you will talk about it in this last day, but I would love to have a conversation with you about this. And here you can see some of the examples that I mentioned that are probably represented in the talks and the examples that you're seeing in this conference. And so reinforcing this diplomatic dimension to me is one of the I think the things we can improve to really convey the importance and the benefit for society of this research infrastructures. So, for example, here, right, you see CERN as one of the landmark examples, already very old, more than 60 years, and you see that it has over 100 countries that use the CERN facilities, more than 13,000 researchers, and this is how we can build those bridges, because you see that the countries that are represented in this map don't necessarily match the best relationships between them, right? So the scientists work together, sometimes in not full alignment with the government position with each other. And we'll talk about that at the end, because this is changing. But in principle, the idea, the principle of science diplomacy is that we can set aside those differences to work together for a shared goal and shared project, shared objective that benefits both or all countries involved, without regard from the individual nationality of the scientists. And as I said, this is now changing, and we'll get to that at the end, and I'd love to discuss. But let me just go through real quick the other two dimensions of science diplomacy before we get into that. The second dimension of science diplomacy is what I think would be most familiar to you, the equivalent to science in policy, or evidence-based policy, or evidence-informed policy, right? The idea that we need to have the best scientific evidence to inform our policy decisions, and when it comes to the international and the multilateral sphere, we need to have science informing those diplomatic negotiations, for example, and most importantly, when we have a global common, for example, the oceans, the outer space, the high seas, the deep seas. How do we manage and govern a space or a resource that doesn't belong to any country? Those global commons are those spaces that are outside of any country's national jurisdiction. And you can see as after World War II, this increase in the number of agreements and treaties that were signed to jointly manage and govern those international spaces speaks to this idea of science becoming more and more a form of governance, because in many of those places, there is no sovereignty or national jurisdiction from any country. And we'll talk a little bit about some of them. And one of the most important examples of how science informs diplomacy is, of course, in climate change negotiations. So we have the IPCC, which is the international network of climate scientists that provide assessments and reports periodically to then serve as the basis for the political negotiations at COPs, and where the diplomats and the politicians can take that information and make decisions based on that scientific evidence. Of course, now our guiding framework for the next few years until 2030, possibly beyond, are the SDGs. And we are seeing now all of the large research infrastructures are trying to map their activities and their scientific areas to the SDGs to convey this societal benefit, how their science can impact, inform, and support the achievement of the SDGs. And science diplomacy itself sits in SDGs 16 and 17 in terms of peace, institutions, partnerships for the goals. And so it is now becoming a central pillar for any research organization to make sure that they align as much as possible and support the achievement of the SDGs. And last but not least, the third dimension of science diplomacy is what we call science for diplomacy or science for peace, is the idea that science can be this language of understanding in situations where the political environment is not so positive. And so setting up research infrastructures that are shared between countries that do not have the best relations can help by bringing individual scientists from these countries, and again, focusing on the science and leaving a little bit at the door the politics. This can help eventually in the long term, can benefit the bilateral and multilateral relations between the nations. And an example here of Sesame in Jordan is that in Sesame Council, every member state gets 2 seats. One is a scientific representative and the other is a diplomatic representative. So that also, in a way, forces every country to align internally, domestically, their science and their diplomacy pieces, right, to represent the country in the council. And it is an exercise that not all countries have done well to connect their scientific policies with their foreign policies. So this is an exercise that by joining one of these infrastructures, each country has to do internally. And so it is both an international effort, but also it benefits at the domestic level to strengthen the ties between science and diplomacy. And so it is important to point out, I think you've already guessed, that the international research infrastructures contribute to all 3 dimensions of science diplomacy. They can be, as we just saw, places where scientists from countries that do not get along can do research together. That is the science for diplomacy aspect. They can provide scientific evidence and advances technology transfer to achieve the SDGs, for example, or to tackle climate change. So all of this knowledge and innovations are contributing to science in diplomacy. And then, of course, because these infrastructures are actually diplomatic agreements, it is a very clear example of diplomacy for science, because the governments are really putting their diplomatic efforts towards building and running those infrastructures. And I don't know if they are represented here in this meeting, but recently IASA in Vienna created a network of international, which I cannot remember the acronym properly, but basically the international research infrastructures for diplomacy so-called bridges and bringing together the science diplomacy, the science diplomacy officers or the different departments or places where these the international research infrastructures are focused on science diplomacy and bring them together in this association. Another example where this happens, even though it's not one single infrastructure, is Antarctica. Antarctica is a very singular example and it's very good to illustrate this because it is a collection of research stations across the continent, but they are not, so that the countries that build and operate those infrastructures are not sovereign. They do not own the territory. They are only there to support scientific advancement, to collaborate, to share knowledge and to work together, but not necessarily own every piece of Antarctica where these flags are placed. And so this is an example of a scientific effort born in the Cold War when countries were, at odds in different ways, but still those founding members of the Antarctic Treaty, which was the diplomatic agreement that was reached, the 12 countries that you see here, that were, not in their best relationships during the Cold War, they all decided to work together for Antarctic research. And today it remains the most successful science diplomacy example that we have. And so all of this, I just, described to you what we call the paradigm until, a few months ago was science diplomacy, but it's very important to update, of course, taking into account, update our thinking and our processes and our paradigms with the times, with the geopolitical environment that we are in. And so since the Russian invasion in Ukraine, we are seeing very strong shifts in these attitudes and motivations and rules for international cooperation. We are seeing things that we haven't seen before, even in other conflicts, in other times of war, in other times of political strain, where different institutions are deciding to now not cooperate anymore with Russia, for example, because it is considered like science is part of the sanctions. Science is part of the, there's a red line now in terms of how far can we cooperate with countries that do not share certain values. And this is what the European Union has recently discussed. And you see here the new directive from the European Council providing guidance on new rules, values-based rules for international cooperation. So principles and values, for example, the guiding principles for cooperation with particular countries will be scientific freedom, gender equality, intellectual property rights, but also democracy, right? So how do we now reconcile or manage or balance these different approaches in terms of, do we have certain conditions to cooperate with certain countries? Is it a good thing that science is part of the sanctions and the embargoes and the punishments for certain countries? How is that going to impact the long term, in terms of having to work with countries for shared goals and shared challenges that we have? And in the specific world of the international research infrastructures, because they are diplomatic institutions as much as scientific institutions, they are faced with this challenge because they have a political mandate, a diplomatic underpinning. They cannot ignore this environment. And for example, CERN recently suspended Russia as an observer, and this had to be taken, this step, because again, this is a diplomatic institution, not just a scientific one, and we cannot just ignore those other dimensions. And so here we have this very complex interplay between the scientific and diplomatic dimensions, and I would love to hear from you, from the institutions that you represent, how is this being managed, and how are you navigating the new geopolitical environment. And just the last word, again, another picture from this, I think Matthew took this one from my visit to SKO. The importance of, and I think you've talked about it, and I don't have time to go into it a lot, in terms of the importance of the research infrastructures for societal engagement, indigenous people's involvement and traditional knowledge. And I think just the SKO is a wonderful example of not just cooperating in shared knowledge in modern times, but also tapping into this ancient knowledge and wisdom that our civilizations have had for thousands of years, and being able to bring this to the public is just wonderful. So I really commend SKO for having such a great emphasis on the cultural and the societal aspects of the cooperation. So with that, I'm going to stop here. I would love to hear your thoughts and reactions and questions to anything that I've shared, and also that you shared with me, how are you navigating this geopolitical new environment and reality. So thank you so much for the invitation. Here's my email, Twitter. You can reach me anytime. And thank you so much again.
Right. Thank you, Marga. That was fantastic. Thank you. Thank you so much. Right. Let's see if we have any questions in the room. We have a bit of time, so thank you to Marga for sticking to time. Any questions in the room for Marga? No, no one wants to be first. Let me check on the Slack. If anyone has questions on Slack, feel free to ask them on the channels. Yes, we have a question there.
Thank you, Marga. It was a really great presentation. I don't even know how to formulate my question, but I guess because, scientific infrastructures have all those diplomacy skills that you mentioned. So how can countries and governments learn from that, and how can we become better at translating all those skills, into other fields of society areas of society, I guess. Sorry, I know what I mean, but it's quite difficult to formulate. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you introduce yourself and just give me a bit of background, where you come from, what institution you represent, what country, just to get a sense?
Sure, sorry. My name is Inés Crespo. I am Research Communications Officer at the Rosalind Institute at the University of Edinburgh.
Wonderful. Yeah, that is the perfect question. And I would say that what I was mentioning before of having more emphasis on the diplomatic and societal aspects is something that we are starting to do better, but we haven't always done, focusing perhaps too much on translating the scientific facts and making sure that the science is understandable. Of course, a very complex science that is done, that is not simplified, but made available for society to understand. But I think it is not always translating in obvious immediate societal benefit. And that's why this, for example, these exercises of mapping the SDGs and how your institution and your research helps with 5 SDGs, and you have this little mapping exercise. Now, I think this is helping a lot, and this is helping both the policymakers and society at large realize the importance of investing and being part of those infrastructures. So I think it is not always obvious. So when you go to talk to politicians, of course, they have a lot of constraints, budget constraints, priorities, shifting all the time, and also short-term view. And so when you ask a country to invest and to become a member of something that will be built in decades, or the first result will come in years, right? The timescales are sometimes conflicting, the political timescales with the scientific timescales, right? So I think we have to do this work of not, of course, promising immediate impact, but I think having this parallel communication in which we can, as we build infrastructure, we start operating it, as we build the technology, education, research cooperation, human resources, all of that, digital capacities, all of that is of direct benefit in terms of jobs and employment and national competitiveness and economic value. And so if we can speak on those terms to those audiences, especially the political audiences, I think we can make a stronger case without, of course, neglecting the scientific case. But sometimes basic science and long-term timescales do not play so well with the politicians. So I think we have to operate in both levels. And the communications officers, the international relations officers in the institutions are incredibly important to achieve that and to make sure that the full benefits of the organization and joining the organization are conveyed, and not only the scientific benefits that will be derived from it.
Great, thank you, Marga. We have a couple more questions, and I can see, I think we've got Maria is one of our speakers later this morning. Maria, you've got your hand up. Do you want to ask your question?
Hello.
Hello, Marga. Thank you, Matthew. And thank you very much, Marga, for this excellent overview of science diplomacy, and especially the important impact of research infrastructures. So I wonder about your point regarding the current conflict that we are living in, and the fact that at the very high political levels, there were issued guidelines about scientific endeavors. So isn't that, what do you think, is that a recognition of the strength that science has achieved as a soft power for diplomatic relations? And should we actually, if this is the case, should we actually, as scientists now, really use this soft power to reach further? Just forgot to present myself, Maria Ljubanova, head of media relations and astronomer at the European Southern Observatory.
Thank you, Maria. So good to see you. Excellent question. I think this is a testament and recognition of the power of science in the national security, right? So it's national competitiveness and just the driver of development, and the new geopolitical races are actually scientific and technological races. So I think we are basically seeing, and we have known this for a long time, but now it's manifesting, I think, much more strongly, that science is not soft in the way of just being a nice kind of altruistic, idealistic endeavor that all scientists work together for the benefit of humanity without, kind of looking for any more material or tangible outcome. It is actually the one driver, the driver is at forefront of all of our economic and geopolitical competitiveness. And so if you think about science and technology, science is also, of course, this language of understanding, this language of peace, this universal language, that I think we should keep that idealistic and aspirational view. We should not, we should never let go of that, because otherwise we would not have, the motivation or the ambition to really imagine or dream these large projects that all together we have to come together as a global community to achieve. And it was a wonderful, I think, boost to that, the images from James Webb, right? This was such a mediatic, an amazing splash all over the world. I've never seen before. People who never cared so much about astronomy, I just, my kind of friends, I saw people sharing the images, like people that would never talk about science, people that would never share scientific facts at all. They were so amazed that they were sharing this all over, right? So I think that was really a boost for this idea of cooperation and having a larger purpose that we can, only together we can reach further and all of that, which is, of course, what the ESO is doing, and SKO and all of those, all of your infrastructures. But besides that, more, let's say, naive or aspirational, I don't like naive. Some people now call the end of the naive era of science diplomacy. I don't like to call naive. But the more aspirational, idealistic dimension, we should not forget. But now I think we have to understand that we are seeing science weaponized. We are seeing science as, in a geopolitical race. And science is also our source of hard power. because when we talk about military action, when we talk about weapons, they also come from scientific innovations and technology, right? And so at GESDA, actually, this new Swiss foundation that is looking at anticipating the diplomatic frameworks for future scientific advances is GESDA is actually trying to figure out what governance and diplomatic frameworks are we going to need for the technologies that we don't have today yet, but we will have in the future. If we have those technologies, they will have positive uses and negative uses. And who decides what's positive and beneficial for whom, and who decides who's negative or detrimental, and what technology should be developed and what should be not. For example, gene editing, neurotechnologies, AI, right? Quantum, are there any guardrails or red lines that we should have in just basic science, because they might lead to perhaps in 30 years undesirable use. And so this is what GESDA is doing to try to, as you say, to anticipate now this second, make sure that this second dimension of science diplomacy, the more competitive, the more geopolitical, the more security related, embedded in science diplomacy, and not just the more aspirational that it's very, I think perhaps too much driven by the scientific community, and not so much by the diplomatic community. The diplomatic community are calling for a more, real politic view of it. But I would love to hear from all of you, or some of you, what is, of course, things that are not sensitive or confidential, but are there any guidelines, or are you seeing these new rules or guidelines in place in your organizations in relation to the new geopolitical situation?
So I'll invite people to answer that on Slack if you'd like to contribute to the discussion, to put in on there. Just as a quick anecdote, because you mentioned JWST, and I realized we haven't really talked about JWST this week in our conference about public awareness of research infrastructures. But this morning I was on my way here and I bumped into my neighbor, and I was, I'm in a rush and we're having a really busy week. And my neighbor went, "Oh, is it anything to do with JWST?" And that was just, wow, okay. Yeah, so that was a great, view of impact, and wide public awareness. So I think we have time for one more question, and then we'll have to wrap it up. Andrea, you had a question?
Yeah, thank you for this talk. You talked a lot about internationally funded research infrastructures. We, especially I and others here, are nationally funded research infrastructures. I come from a neutron source in Germany, Andrea Voigt. But we have international users. It's not only Germans using it, but Europeans, Americans, Japanese, whatever. And we don't have we don't have a liaison officer. So is there anything you could recommend for scientists or for press officers as we are? How could we gain the experience to be able to do science diplomacy? Because that's something that is lacking in our formation and also in the formation of the scientists. They're not experienced to talk to politicians. Mm-hmm. And sometimes I get the feeling that they speak different languages, but they cannot study political science, right? So yeah, is there any means or any formations you could recommend?
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. I'm happy to talk more offline. There are different trainings and opportunities for science diplomacy workshops and courses. Different organizations are, and more we are seeing more of these trainings emerge. I will just plug one, which is the one I run in Geneva. But there are many more. The Science and Diplomacy Week in Geneva. I'll put it on the chat. It was actually the first edition in May, so it's very recent. And it's an immersion program for scientists and diplomats to spend together a week in Geneva and explore the nexus and the interface between science and diplomacy in situ, in the different institutions. So both the diplomatic institutions, as you know, Geneva is host of the UN office, and also a number of international organizations, think tanks, NGOs, So that is a very rich ecosystem to learn about this, but also, of course, universities. CERN is in Geneva. So for instance, we spend the whole day at CERN exploring this question because CERN is very advanced in the diplomatic. They have a whole international relations department, and the person who runs it is a former diplomat in the UN. So they are really, really experienced and skilled to to tackle the diplomatic aspects that you mentioned that not all the other infrastructures have. So this is something that you could certainly come to next year, and I can put it on the chat. But there are others like AAAS, like TWAS, the INCSA, the International Network for Government Science Advice. There are many opportunities, and if you email me, I can recommend some. I know that the German government recently launched a science diplomacy strategy. There are very good science diplomacy scholars and practitioners in Germany, so I can also put you in touch. And so I think as a recommendation, apart from going to some of these courses and trainings, I would recommend to finding ways to capitalize on this international network of users that you have. So if it's an informal network, how can you make it more formal? How can do you have a community management strategy for them? And is there more strategic relations that you can build with their countries? Even if they come in as individual users and individual scientists, how can you capitalize on that network? And so I think these types of trainings and courses can help you strategize on that and help you frame it in a way that encompasses more explicitly this diplomatic aspect. Let me just put on the chat for you to have it for next year. It's going to be in May.
Thank you, Marga. We're going to have to wrap it up, but I will just ask you a 30-second thought about a really, really difficult question to wrap this up and get people thinking. We often say that science is not political, and we often hear that our research infrastructures are not political. Given the talk you've just given, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, that's the million-dollar question.
Sorry.
I would say the answer is science is not political, but scientists are political. There's no human that is not biased in different ways about different things, right? So even if physics and astrophysics can be as pure as you get, whoever performs the science is the human, and the human has, until AI does it for us, but even AI is biased because the algorithms are based on the human record. And so I think that is the baseline to then have the discussion on how politicized or not the institutions should get and should be. And I think there are different, it's not black and white, so it's really a spectrum. And we see some that have been really strong in saying, here's my red line, I'm not going to cooperate with you at all. Some are putting some conditional and some more nuanced aspects. And some others really don't want to stop cooperating with Russia in this case, or with countries that are in this dynamic right now, because in the long term, they see that they will need the researchers from that country, the facilities from that country, and in the end, they are all UN members that they are still glued together, especially those institutions that are under a UN umbrella. They, like WHO, for example, they cannot kick out any member state because that is a UN, it's the mandate of the UN, and that's it. And so it is not easy. I put it simplified, and sometimes it sounds black and white, but it's not. I just invite you to consider this, like how can we separate the science from the organization, the political, the diplomatic, and it's maybe the price we pay for evolving those institutions to have become diplomatic institutions. There are many advantages and benefits, and perhaps you can speak more of the transition for SKA and how now the transition that has led to becoming a diplomatic institution, and what does that come with trade-offs, and perhaps the political will come. There will be some political issues coming as a result of having evolved into this new government regime. And so, sorry, I don't answer the question. I leave more questions, but it really is something that we're going to be grappling for a long time. So we just have to keep this conversation going as constructive as we can in the difficult time that we are living.
Great. Thank you very much, Marga. I think that's a really good thought to end on. So let's thank Marga again.